From the financial centers of the world, this is Bloomberg Markets with Alix Steel and Guy Johnson.
Wednesday the 13th, 3 p.m. in London, 10 a.m. in New York, 30 minutes into the trading day in the United States. From London, I'm Guy Johnson, Alix Steel over in New York. Welcome, everybody, to Bloomberg Markets. Alex, inflation is hot. Do we know yet, though, whether transitory is a dirty word?
Well, according to Bostic, it seems like most definitely it is. So you guys over in the UK, I feel like definitely found Godot with those higher inflation and inflation expectations. Here, we don't yet know. Is it permanent, Godot, or is it going to be transitory? So the S&P kind of going nowhere here. Part of the downside is going to be JP Morgan. We'll get to that in just a second, getting hit by over 2%. Now, the NASDAQ able to climb its way higher as the back-end yields come lower. That up by 0.5%. Also, SAP revived its revenue forecast higher for the year on cloud sales. That really helping to support the NASDAQ 100. So what's happening to the curve is quite interesting. It's getting flatter because you're getting a little bit of sell-off in the front end with yields pushing higher by about 2-3 basis points. On the back end, though, some pretty strong buying. I hate to say it, but isn't that what you see when you're thinking you're going to see stagflation? You're going to see that kind of flattening. The VIX, though, staying elevated as the buy-the-dip retail guys haven't been in force just as much as we're used to, which leaves a lot of questions to where the direction and what's going to be a driver of the S&P right now. So let's get to some of those earnings, particularly when it comes to JP Morgan. As I mentioned, that stock is lower, posting third quarter results exceeded expectations, revenue from mergers nearly tripling, and helping to push the bank's net income to $11.7 billion. The bank made a ton of money. So joining us now, Bloomberg's Wall Street reporter, Shanali Basak. Shanali, it was solid numbers. Why is the stock down?
Yeah, it's very interesting because even with that decline in fixed income, they more than made up for it in equities. So if they have gained share relative to Goldman and Morgan Stanley, huge boon for JP Morgan. But on the other hand, you also have a signal that expenses are going to rise into next year. You also have a signal that it will take some time for the consumer to really come back in a lot of different loan areas. Analysts really pressured all the executives on the call recently about what they can expect for loan growth, and they would not give a direct guidance on average loan growth. So still a lot to be seen, but overall, JP Morgan really striking a very sanguine tone on the economy, seeing more ahead for jobs, higher wages, but they are still worried, as we've been talking about inflation.
Yeah, trades on 2 times book, and the curve's flatter today. Shanali, as you say, it was a solid set of numbers, but the stock's come a long way. Shanali Basak covering JP Morgan. We're going to see a lot of her this week as the earnings season continues for Wall Street's banks. Let's talk about what Shanali was talking about as she left off. Inflationary pressures persisting in the U.S. economy. Consumers paying more for food and housing. That was a big component of the pickup we've seen in the latest CPI data. Here to kind of give us an understanding of what we've got and maybe how the Fed's going to react to it, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent, Mike McKee.
Well, Guy, we can explain CPI in the United States just by looking at this chart here. Here, you got too low. Here, you got too high. And this is what happened. The headline number goes up to 5.4%, while the core stays flat at 4%. So we're going to have that argument that goes on between the Raphael Bostics and the Rich Claritas. Mr. Clarita yesterday saying the CPI target more than met. The idea, though, is that you put this together with this and you get the Fed's average, and maybe then means they can go ahead and taper. You mentioned food and housing. Those were the 2 biggest components. They accounted for more than half of the rise in the CPI this month. Food at home in particular up 1.2%. It is really rising quickly. Bacon was up 19%. That's my favorite because I gotta have the bacon in at 19%. That's going to be a lot. I put this in here. Gasoline prices were up significantly as well, but natural gas is what everybody's talking about, and I know Guy has a particular interest in it. It is nothing like what you're paying, but 2.7%. This is roughly double what it was in August, and we're going to see that continue probably. Now, the interesting thing is used cars. We thought they might go back up again. They continue to go down, and apparel prices, especially for women's suits, fall. So I guess Alex and everybody else is still wearing sweatpants to work because women's dresses aren't selling at this point and they are cutting prices. Leaves us with a debate. When do we taper? When do we tighten? And what do you wear on Casual Friday when every day is casual?
I've never, ever worn sweatpants to work, by the way, Mike. You should know better. Mike McKee from Bloomberg, thanks a lot. All right, now let's go to space, because William Shatner, 3 other passengers, will launch into space in just moments on the second crewed flight of Blue Origin's rocket. Here with all the details is Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Hey, Ed, what's happening right now?
Yeah, from sweatpants to spacesuits. The crew have gone to the launch pad, chauffeured no less by Jeff Bezos in a battery electric Rivian. They've crossed the gantry, you can see there, boarding into the capsule. We're tracking for liftoff around 10:30 Eastern time from Van Horn, Texas, reaching speeds of Mach 3, G-forces 3 times that of Earth. And they're going to an apogee of around, wow, is that William Shatner getting into that? That is William Shatner getting into that capsule. Of course, Captain Kirk. So they're going to go to 62 miles above the Earth for just a few minutes of weightlessness. This is an exact replication of what Bezos did in July, and it's an effort towards commercial space tourism, an industry that UBS says could reach $4 billion annually by 2030, guys.
In terms of what they're going to do, how long does it last? What are we going to see over the next few minutes, Ed?
Yeah, so the climb is about 3 to 4 minutes. They spend just literally 2 to 3 minutes in zero-G weightlessness before they unbuckle from their seats. And after a while of doing somersaults, floating around, if the mission goes successfully, they're instructed to get back into their seats because Earth's gravitational pull simply drags the capsule back down. And then, you know, it free falls using aerodynamics, that flat bottom of the capsule to slow down before deploying chute. So this is a fraction. This is just very modest compared to what we saw from SpaceX Inspiration 4, which you and I covered in such detail, Guy, in Florida last month. You know, that was a 3-day trip. This is a 3-minute trip. There are 2 paying customers on board, 2 guests that are flying for free, including William Shatner. So it's really right now a marketing exercise for Blue Origin. It's about proving the technology and getting the global audience interested ahead of a fully commercial rollout.
Well, Ed, that was my next question, because having William Shatner go up in space is probably the best marketing scheme I've ever heard of in my entire life. Who is Jeff Bezos talking to with that?
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, of the 4, there are 2 fee-paying customers. We have no idea how much they're being charged. We don't know whether it's subsidized by the company, by Bezos. By comparison, Virgin Galactic is charging $450,000 a pop for its 4 minutes of weightlessness. Bezos has been really candid the whole time about this being a marketing exercise. He compares it to the early days of aviation when those stunt pilots would go up you know, in the biplanes, essentially, to demonstrate that the technology worked before it became much more mainstream. And of course, you know, flying on an airplane is very normal today. That's a part of it. It's not just selling to high net worth customers. That's what the hope is, but it's also basically getting people interested in space so that it becomes more of a commonplace thing. But, you know, as you and I have discussed, Alex, time and time again, especially in our coverage on the Space Race show, right now this is very much a rich man's sport.
Absolutely. And if you happen to be the former captain of the Enterprise,
he's also kind of a rich man too, but whatever.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I don't think he's quite in the same stratospheric orbit as some of the others that are playing this game. Ed, come back. I think we've got, what, 23 minutes until launch. We'll continue to track what is happening on the launch pad. Ed will come back as soon as we've started to see things getting a little hotter, quite literally. And we'll come back, we'll talk to Ed, we'll figure out exactly what's happening and how the whole thing's going. Let's turn our attention a little closer to Earth, but maybe a different planet. House lawmakers clearing a bill to increase the debt limit yesterday, basically sending now the measure to the president's desk. Negotiators aim to delay the debt ceiling deadline now until December. Here with the latest, Courtney Rosen of Bloomberg Government. Courtney, what happens now? As I say, it's going to the president, but just walk us through the mechanics of this whole process.
President Biden is expected to sign it. So first off, they're good to go till December 3rd. After that, the situation returns to the same as we've been talking about for weeks now. And so far, the arguments on Capitol Hill are mostly the same debate. Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell told the president that his party will not help lift the debt ceiling this round in December. And Speaker Pelosi on the Democratic side is digging her heels in, saying Democrats won't go at it on their own. We're back at the same debate. One difference this time is that Speaker Pelosi suggested that she could support legislation that would allow the Treasury Department to lift the debt cap on its own. That would keep this all off Capitol Hill and something they could do themselves. Not sure yet if there's broad support for that in the Democratic Party to actually move that across the finish line. So it sets up a busy start to December, and we're back in the same debate once again.
Yeah, it doesn't look good on that front. All right, Courtney Rosen of Bloomberg Government, thank you very much. We appreciate it. All right, coming up, earnings. They're here. They're kicking off. JP Morgan, super solid numbers, yet the stock is down. What does that mean about expectations here? Sarah Ponzik, UBS Private Wealth Management Financial Advisor Associate, joins us next. This is Bloomberg.
Let's check in on the Bloomberg First Word News. I'm Laura Wright. President Biden turns his focus to supply chain transportation bottlenecks today. He'll meet with corporate executives, labor leaders and port officials. The president will highlight what they've done to ease distribution backlogs. Meanwhile, the congested port of Los Angeles will announce a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week effort to confront the squeeze on goods. Vladimir Putin says Russia is ready to supply as much natural gas as Europe needs. Speaking at an energy forum in Moscow, the Russian leader said it was very important to stabilize the market. Europe faces a gas crisis ahead of the winter due to a surge in prices and a drop in reserves. The European Union will offer a fresh round of concessions to the UK over Northern Ireland in the newest Brexit negotiations. The EU will propose cutting as much as 50% of the customs checks in Northern Ireland and up to 80% of the sanitary checks on food imports. The Northern Ireland Protocol keeps the province in the EU's single market, unlike the rest of the UK. The UK wants changes in the agreement. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Laura Wright. This is Bloomberg. Guy, Alex.
All right, thanks so much, Laura. So markets digesting earnings plus inflation. What's already priced in, though, is the question. Joining us now is Sarah Ponzik, a UBS Private Wealth Management Financial Advisor Associate. Always good to see you. We're headed into earnings. You got JP Morgan with great numbers. That stock is down. What's priced right now?
It's always great to see you, Alex. And we have to be careful. Yes, we had earnings reports this morning. The third quarter season has officially begun, but 45 minutes into the trading session, we can't take too much of a definitive message away. Now, what's been interesting is heading into this earnings season, markets have really been trading off of the macro. Ever since early September, the last time that markets hit all-time highs, there has been focus on DC drama. There's been focus on the Federal Reserve, and rightly so, but a more hawkish than expected Federal Reserve and the expectation of higher bond yields, which maybe we're not seeing so much this morning, but that's where the focus has really been. So now, as we enter earnings season, what's nice is we get to focus a little bit more on the fundamentals. I know we hear that going into every earnings season, but we also get to hear from the executives and get their boots on the ground view. So what are they seeing as it relates to labor shortages, wages, supply chain disruptions? These are all the things that matter. These are all the things that markets and investors are focused on, but there are still plenty of questions remaining.
What we're expecting, Sarah, and it's good to see you too, is that we're going to hear a lot about that, and there's going to be a lot of chat about the fact that companies' margins are under pressure. What do you think the top line is going to look like, though? I'm really interested at the moment. We're focusing on the kind of the supply side shortages, but the demand side, the U.S. economy, the global economy, still looks super strong right now.
It's great to see you too, Guy. The top line is expected to be very strong. We still are expected to see revenue growth in the realm of 15% or so. And I do think it's very important to sit back and look at all of this in perspective, because even if we look at profits, what are we expecting for S&P 500 profits in the third quarter? No, we're not going to see anything like we saw in the second quarter. The second quarter was very likely the peak. We saw S&P 500 profits grow 90%. That is not normal. Yes, there were very easy comps. Well, now the comps get a little bit more challenging. The environment is a little bit more challenging, but profits are still expected to grow 30%. That is not a small number by any means. That is still very strong growth. Revenues are still expected to be very strong, as I mentioned before. And we also have to keep in mind that in the second quarter, we actually saw record profit margins around 13% or so. So yes, we may see profit margins narrow a bit, but the question is, have companies been able to pass on costs to consumers? Have they been able to absorb those costs? And will they be able to continue to do so as the supply chain disruptions linger?
Yeah, but if they can actually sell them the product, I guess becomes the question, which leads me to Apple. That stock down by about 1.25% today, so picking up a little bit of steam to the downside, as they basically said, we don't have enough chips to sell the phones that we promised that we were going to sell. What do you do when Apple starts to complain about supply chain issues?
Right. Supply chain disruptions are no doubt right now at the forefront. When we continue to see inflationary pressures, as we did see this morning, it's not just coming from the demand side, it's coming from the supply side too. And I think as we look at the past couple of months, at the past year or so, this has lingered longer than many economists, investors, markets, you could say, expected these disruptions to last for. However, at the same time, we're not necessarily of the belief that we will see supply chain disruptions remain permanently with us. It's still related to COVID-19. And as we continue to work through the virus, we are starting to see numbers come down. We could see a normalization.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How do I position for an easing of the supply chain story? Jamie Dimon's talking about it. Others are talking about it as well. We're starting to see maybe an easing in the European gas story, driven by Vladimir Putin. There's a number of things that may be starting to come off the boil a little bit, off the peak. Sarah, how do I position for inflation to actually be transitory?
So we're still optimistic on the economic recovery, supply chain disruptions, inflationary pressures. This all feeds into this. So when you look at a continuation of the economic recovery, where do we look? We're still optimistic on financials. We're still optimistic on energy stocks. That even after the fantastic run that we have seen this year, financials up about 30%. That's roughly double the return that we've seen of the S&P 500. Energy up a whopping 50%. But at the same time, we do still expect the yield curve to steepen as the economy does continue to recover. Again, it's important to keep everything in perspective. Yes, we are going to see slower growth going forwards, but slower growth is not synonymous with slow growth. We're still talking about above trend growth this year, above trend growth next year. And that's an environment where you want to make sure you are embracing companies that are really more so tied to benefit from that.
Sarah, always a pleasure. Nice to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Sarah Ponzek of UBS Private Wealth Management. Okay, what do we got coming up for you? Apple's iPhone 13 running into a little bit of trouble. It's starting to ripple down the supply chain. We're going to talk about that next. This is the impact on Skyworks, down by 2.3%. I'm surprised the market reaction isn't bigger, but I guess we've been talking about this for a while. This is Bloomberg.
It's time for the Bloomberg Business Flash, a look at some of the biggest business stories in the news right now. I'm Laura Wright. Delta Airlines has reported the first quarterly profit at a major U.S. carrier since the pandemic began. That's excluding federal aid. Still, Delta warned that rising jet fuel prices are a threat to staying in the black. The airline said that third quarter revenue returned to 66% of 2019 levels. OPEC is sounding a cautious note on the strength of oil demand. That's despite international crude prices surging above $80 a barrel for the first time in several years. OPEC has revised down its estimate for global oil consumption this year. The cartel also said that the spike in natural gas prices could boost petroleum use in some areas but hurt it in others, such as refining. Michael Burry's profitable bets against the housing bubble were immortalized in The Big Short. Now, the doctor turned investor has gone on a Twitter rant against taxes. Burry denounced what he calls U.S. class warfare, and he challenged the notion that the rich don't pay enough taxes. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Guy, Alex.
Laura, thank you very much indeed. Let's talk about what is happening with the ripple effect of the Apple news on the iPhone 13. Skyworks got a double hit today, got a downgrade from Baird, and it's sliding on the Apple production news. Let's figure out exactly what this all means. Dave Wilson, all the details.
Thanks, Guy. Let's start with the company-specific call. You have Baird moving to the equivalent of hold from buy, in essence, neutral from outperform. And they're focusing on the radio frequency chip business of Skyworks. Yeah, and that's basically how cell phones communicate with those semiconductors. Now, Baird's figuring that growth across the industry slows to something like 10% this year from more than 30% last year. And, even more of a slowdown after that. And so that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is the story that we reported out of Apple. People familiar with the matter saying there may be cuts coming to iPhone production this quarter, as many as 10 million phones. And, since they were targeting 90 million, according to our reporting, you're talking about an 11% drop there. And, this is a company, when you look at Skyworks, that's really dependent on Apple. You're talking 50% of revenue. And the second biggest company, Samsung, only about 5% based on our supply chain data. So, that tells you how important Apple is to Skyworks. And, put it all together, and it does become an issue for this company.
Hey, Dave, what about other Apple suppliers?
Well, as far as that goes, you're seeing kind of a mixed bag. I mean, Guy was wondering before the break why you haven't seen more of a move in Skyworks and the other suppliers. For the most part, chip makers are up today. You look at the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, but you are seeing weakness in those companies that are most dependent on Apple, Broadcom, Qorvo. Jabil, which is actually an assembler of electronics, and Apple is their biggest source of revenue. And, Qualcomm, as a contrast, they're buying back $10 billion of stock. They laid that out late yesterday, adding that much to their current repurchase program. So that would help explain why Qualcomm is going more with the packaged chip makers and less with the Apple suppliers.
Fair enough. All right, Dave, thanks a lot. Really appreciate Bloomberg's Dave Wilson joining us there. Well, something else that we're also watching right now is Blue Origin. It's scheduled to launch from Van Horn, Texas. We're a little delayed now, but should be maybe within the next 15 minutes, although the countdown clock looks paused, I think, for the time being. It's going to carry 4 individuals, 2 paying guests, and 2 that will fly for free. One of them, of course, being William Shatner. And like I mentioned earlier, Guy, there's literally no other better PR trick than getting William Shatner up in space. The guy's 90.
He is a nonagerian, which is a word I had to look up a little bit earlier on, which apparently is between 90 and 99. So yeah, he is going to become the oldest person ever to go into space. They will be into space. This is a suborbital trip, but nevertheless, he will pass the crucial sort of line and therefore become the oldest person ever to make that journey. But as we were talking about earlier on, this is a huge PR stunt in some ways. They are basically trying to drum up future business. But as you say as well, can you think of a better person than William Shatner, Captain T. Kirk? This is Bloomberg.
It's a T-minus 15 minutes to go. We are in a hold here. Why don't we send it back?
There's a lot of talk about stagflation, but really what's going on is we have an inflationary boom. Stagflation is when demand is slowing down and prices are remaining firm. Right now, one of the reasons why prices are still firm is because demand is still quite buoyant.
That was Neil Dutta, Renaissance Macro Securities Head of Economic Research, speaking to Bloomberg earlier. Just we got the latest U.S. CPI numbers that did come in hot. Here for more, Omer Sharif, Inflation Insights founder and president. Omer, you're literally one of the people that dissect all the details of inflation. You're the inflation guy, one of like 2 that we frequent here. What was your read?
Look, it's a little bit of everything in there depending on your point of view. So if you think inflation is accelerating into next year, it's going to be a problem for the Fed. You can point to what happened with shelter, a big acceleration, big move in rents. But on the flip side of things, you can also look at things like used cars, for example, slow down today. So I think, there's still a lot of noise in this data. If I look at sort of the 3-month move in the core CPI, we're running about 2.7% annualized right now. That's a big step down from where we were earlier in the summer. There's going to continue to be noise over the next several months, but I think, really the Fed's going to have to wait until next spring, early next summer, really to get a better read on where sort of the underlying trend is in inflation.
Okay, what do you think they're going to be seeing by then? Is this something that is going to continue, i.e. we see consecutive price changes, or is this a one-off price shock?
So there's two different sets of things that are going to be seen. One is sort of the sticky prices, if you will. So shelter is going to accelerate. We're running about 2.5% on rent right now. I expect we'll be probably closer to 4.5% by, let's call it mid-2022. You're also going to get a big increase in medical care prices going forward because sort of a quirk in the CPI data, but we should start seeing health insurance, for example, really firm up and give medical care support next year. That's around 50% of the core CPI right there that will be picking up steam. So that's what people are pointing to and saying, look, the Fed's going to have an inflation problem on their hands next summer. The flip side of this is you have to expect some sort of normality or some normalization in the durables. So things like used cars, furnishings. To be fair, that's very dependent on how long it takes the supply chain to heal. But to the extent that it does, you don't even need these prices to fall. If they just flatten out, you'll have a huge move down in that part of the inflation basket. So I think they're going to have to weigh these two different things and figure out, what's the offset here? Mm-hmm. We're going to get higher shelter. We're going to get weaker durables. Where does that leave us? And I suspect it's going to leave us somewhere around 2.5 to maybe about 2.75 on core CPI by next summer.
One more question on that point. As we're trying to look for what's sticky and what's not, we're all blaming the supply issues from COVID. Are there any other supply issues that are maybe more permanent? And I'm thinking more like the trade war that was started kind of many years ago, for example, or even the conflict between China and the West or Taiwan and China.
Right. So look, I mean, on the trade war front, we've got some, we've got some movement where people might get some relief, according to the Biden administration. That's not really clear how that's going to pan out. But, I would just say that going back all the way to 2018, when we first had these tariffs slapped onto imported goods, from what I saw, there wasn't a massive impact on the U.S. CPI from trade. There was a couple of months where you saw some pops. For the most part, it maybe added about 20 to 30 basis points that I could find at least onto the core CPI. So I don't think that was really a huge story. Whether we got some relief on that front, I'm not sure. But whether some of these changes are longer lasting, it's sort of unclear. I think right now it's still really about kind of the short-term noise in the data.
How is this going to work its way into wages?
Well, we saw a little bit of this already working its way into wages. If you look at, for example, at fast food chains, we've seen already a big pop in wage growth in that sector over the last several months. And we've seen that sort of filter its way into the CPI. So over the last couple of months, we've seen some very, very big gains in a category called limited service meals. It's just a fancy way of saying fast food prices. Those have started to accelerate. So that's at least one sector where we can say, look, it looks like the wage growth we're seeing is actually translating into higher prices that consumers are paying. Now, it's not clear that's really showing up elsewhere. Honestly, part of that is because we really haven't seen wage growth of this magnitude, at least the last 15 or 20 years, really impact the CPI. So we have to be on the lookout for that, certainly. But right now, I still see some sort of limited pass-through from wages. I think there's more of a pass-through from what you're seeing in the PPI, for example, and today's grocery price impact is one example of that. You're seeing product prices increase for the producers. They're passing some of that on to the consumers. You can see it in, for example, places like furnishings as well. So I think that's a bigger picture, or bigger story for core CPI right now than just the wage story.
Fair point. Looking at the curve, it's pretty obvious what we're looking at, potentially a stagflation situation where you have the Fed hiking potentially, and then you have short-term yields moving higher, but then that's going to create some kind of growth, lack of impulse, I guess, and then you're going to see growth come down. You're seeing buying in the long end. Omer, do you think that that's the best way to be looking at this read?
Yes, I have a hard time with the stagflation story in general. I understand the inflation data is up right now, and that's one half of the story. We're looking at growth this year around 5.5% to maybe 6%. Even for next year, you're talking about growth somewhere around 4% is sort of the best estimates out there. So to me, that's a pretty far cry from stagflation right now. And I think just step back for a second. We're talking about Fed rate hikes. We're looking for a taper announcement starting in November. That's going to work its way through at least probably June or July of next year. My suspicion is the Fed is still on sort of a 2023 path, not a late 22, because I still think that there's some slack left in the labor market that they want to press on. So, I'm not a huge buyer of the stagflation story just yet. I also think that we need to keep in mind that if I'm right about the durable story into next year, that's going to be a huge offset for inflation. And so we're going to be coming way off this sort of 5% type numbers to something closer to the Fed's target.
And that's the sweet spot. So what do you do if you are the Fed at that point? You've talked about running the inflation, the economy hot. You are basically saying that we're going to wait for actually a fairly symmetrical event to start raising rates. Where do you think that puts us?
It's always difficult to answer the question because I think there's what the Fed should do and what they will probably end up doing. My feeling is more that if we get inflation back down to somewhere around 2.5%, and I think on the core PC, we're probably talking more like 2.25 by next summer, then I think you can kind of hold off. If you're only 20, 30 bips above your sort of 2% target, I think if you're the Fed, you have to then take stock of where the labor market is. If you believe you're at full employment, that's one thing. But I think there's some evidence to suggest that there's still some ways to go on the full employment front. We've seen a bit of a slowdown, obviously, in job growth. If we continue to that pace, it would take us well into 23 to really get back to the early 2020 labor market. So I think if you're the Fed and you can get inflation back into that 2 to 2.5% range, I think you want to keep pushing on the labor market, trying to get back to full employment as soon as you can.
Talking about employment for a second here, and we saw in JOLTS, there are a lot of people quitting their jobs, whether it's early retirement or they have enough of a cushion now that they can just hang out and wait for a job that they really want, which presumably could come at higher wages. Do you have any evidence that that is actually happening right now?
Well, I mean, we've seen the wage growth data. We've heard, I think it's more anecdotal at this point because the ECI, which sort of, adjust for these compositional changes, hasn't really moved too dramatically, although it's starting to sort of, bubble a little bit. So, it's not clear that a lot of this movement is necessarily people just jumping from one job to the next for that higher wage. There could be some shifts within sectors as well. So, for example, we're seeing a huge number of quits in manufacturing. I think it was well over 300,000 people quit last month within the manufacturing sector. They could be moving within manufacturing to other jobs, potentially for higher wages. But I don't know that it's very clear yet. I still think the jury's sort of out on that right now.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Really fantastic to get the extra insight into what is happening here. Come back next time that we get the CPI data out. It'd be great to get your take on what is happening as we evolve this story. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, coming up, we're just a few minutes away. How many minutes away? 11 minutes away now from the launch of Blue Origin's second crewed space flight. We're going to take you to Van Horn, Texas next. We'll figure out exactly what is happening. A series of delays, but now we look like we're back on track. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm Laura Wright. You're looking at a live shot of the principal room. Aneta Markowska, Jefferies' chief U.S. financial economist. That's at 12 p.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.
William Shatner and 3 other passengers will launch into space, hopefully in just moments' time, on the second crewed flight of Blue Origin's rocket. You're looking at the countdown clock. We're about T-7. Here with some details, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Ed, where are they now? What are they doing? What are we going to see?
Yeah, so the 4 crew members are sitting in their reclining seats. The seats are kind of at 45-degree angles with a corresponding window, right? So they're leaning back, facing up to the heavens, awaiting launch in around 7 minutes' time. We had a series of holds where they stopped the countdown. And basically, the reason Blue Origin and others like SpaceX do that is there are lots of different teams that have to land at liftoff at the same time. It's a very precise science, much of it run by artificial intelligence. So if one team of engineers or monitors is running behind, they simply pause the countdown wait for it to catch up. It's often nothing sinister. It might just be a delay in some of the cooling systems or venting some of the byproduct gases, for example. They start fueling the rocket about 3 hours before launch. So a lot of the work's already been done. So we're 6.5 minutes away. Over the course of 60 seconds, they'll lift off, reach the moment of maximum dynamic pressure and stress on the vessel, and then eventually reach a speed of about Mach 3 or 2,000 miles or so an hour. 3 Gs of force on the way up. And of course, on board, You heard me get excited a little bit earlier. William Shatner, of course, wants Captain Kirk. But this is a marketing exercise, right? This is about drawing eyeballs to Blue Origin, in part to get future-paying customers, high-net-worth individuals, and in part because Jeff Bezos genuinely believes, so he says, that he needs to inspire mankind to want to go into space because we have finite resources here on Earth, and he feels that by looking to commodities out in space, we can kind of better shore up the future of our planet. That's the rationale that Bezos presents, at least.
Ed, stick around. We're continuing to count down. 5 minutes, 51 seconds still to go until launch. Also joining us now, Keith Cohen, former NASA employee and editor of the blog Space Ref and NASAWatch.com. Keith, what does the industry, what do the insiders think about the fact that we have William Shatner, we have Captain Kirk going into space?
Well, you know, you always need a good pitch man, somebody who's identified with the product. And, I cannot think of a better person than William Shatner, a.k.a. Captain Kirk, full stop.
So, Keith, what do you think the evolution of this becomes? Like, is this going to be a monthly thing that Jeff Bezos is just going to do? And what does that do to the industry?
Well, you know, the model that's often brought up is how commercial airlines started, where it was barnstormers, where you wondered if they were crazy. And then they found a way to build bigger airplanes, but they had to hopscotch across the Pacific. And then someone said, you know what, I can build a bigger plane. And then he served champagne. And then somebody said, you know what, I can do it cheaper. And it's sort of a classic thing where you hope that, you know, once the hoopla gets out of the way, that people will say, I want to do that. And since this is all private, you want the classic competition thing to come into play where someone says, I can fly more people for cheaper. Here's where you buy the ticket.
In terms of what this becomes, though, Keith, there was a sort of an end game in terms of what happened with the aviation industry. It was about the journey, but it was about getting from A to B. What does the A to B look like with this industry? I appreciate the journey up into space is absolutely epic, and seeing the Earth from there will be something that I hope I get to experience. But nevertheless, is there a kind of a second iteration, i.e. this becomes something else, this becomes part of the transport infrastructure, this becomes part of something else? I'm just curious as to whether tourism is an end in itself.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, just a few miles away, east in Texas, SpaceX is building the Starship. And it's sort of like, having a tractor-trailer truck that can drive across town or drive across country. And the idea behind Starship is that not only can it launch large payloads into space, to Moon, and to Mars, but roughly the same vehicle could do what's called a ballistic hop, so that you could have flights from London to Sydney in 50 minutes. And, given that these are completely reusable and are built in sort of the airline servicing mode, you could be launching these things not much different than an A3, well, maybe not an A380 since they weren't economical, but a large airliner.
Wow. Okay. London to Australia in 50 minutes. That would be crazy. We're about T-minus 30 right now for that launch. So that brings up an excellent point. What is the business model? You mentioned a lot of different things, and I wonder, is the end goal low orbit space to get satellites up there efficiently, and what the profit will be there? Is it going to be some kind of transport? The fact that we're all going to wind up living in Mars and like renting a condo on Mars, that's probably not going to happen.
Well, you pretty much answered your own question in terms of it is more than one thing. It's launching satellites, it's launching people, it's taking things up, it's bringing them back, it's sending things out and exploring the universe. And again, it just comes back to, if you could just imagine, an existing infrastructure model, whether it's airlines or shipping or automobiles, you just got to sit there and think, do I want to be a one-trick pony? And so far, it would seem these companies are not. And if you look at Blue Origin, just look at the history of Amazon. This was a loss leader for decades, with the thought that someday this model will eventually turn a profit, and the same guy is doing Blue Origin. So, there you go.
Keith, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. We're looking at the space launch kind of beginning here. We're about 1 minute, T-minus 1 minute. Thank you so much, Keith, for joining us. Let's take a listen in. We're about 60, 90 seconds away from the launch with William Shatner going to space.
All right, everybody. Chris Boshausen, Glenn DeVries, Audrey Powers, and William Shatner are about to go where very few humans have gone before. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to launch this rocket. Godspeed, New Shepard.
Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Command engine start. 2, 1.
With the second human spaceflight crew. What a launch. We are on our way to Max Q, the first milestone here on its flight to space. Obviously with the altimeter at the base of the screen as well as the speedometer. They are gaining speed on their climb to space. We have confirmed max Q. This is when the aerodynamic stresses on the vehicle were at their maximum. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us live for New Shepard's second human flight with Audrey Powers, William Shatner, our customers Glenn DeVries and Chris Boshausen on board. They are well on their way to space. So far, a nominal flight, a clean burn on our Blue Engine 3.
You're looking at a live shot of Blue Origin. Its second launch here, taking William Shatner and 3 other individuals to space. Let's get the update with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow joining us. Hey, Ed, what are we looking at right now?
Yeah, so they're traveling to a distance of 62 miles above the Earth. That's their apogee, their highest point. And any moment now, the capsule that sits on top of the booster will separate off and carry on the rest of that journey. That happens at around 47 miles above the Earth. You can see that they're traveling at a speed of around 1,600 miles an hour under intense G-force. And very soon after that separation, that's when the crew will be instructed to unbuckle, unharness from their seats for literally what is just a couple of minutes, just a few minutes of weightlessness. And as we know from the previous mission in July with Jeff Bezos, his brother, Wally Funk and Oliver Damon, they'll have the opportunity to do somersaults, high-five each other, chuck a ping pong ball around, and whatever it is that one wants to do in space when one is up there for a couple of minutes. But it's very short, and the critical safety element is that when the control room signals in and crew member 7, who's their support auxiliary crew member on the ground, chimes in that they have to get back into their seats, then they do, because 62 miles above the Earth is technically space, right? It's above the Kármán line, but it's still within Earth's gravitational pull. And the capsule will start to descend back down to Earth and then start to pick up its speed, an even greater force than it did on the way up. So they'll be under immense stress, and it's important they're back in their seats at that point.
Ed, you talk about them being under immense stress. William Shatner is in his 90s. If he can tolerate this, I'm assuming that most people can tolerate this. This isn't completely sort of debilitating stress that they're coming under. As you say, 3G, that's quite a lot, 3 times Earth gravitational force, but nevertheless manageable. And I'm wondering what that tells us about the available pool of people that could potentially go up and replicate what they're doing today.
This is the product guide. This is what Blue Origin designed this to be, that they want anyone to be able to fly with minimal training up to that 62 miles apogee. You know, the crew arrived about 3 days before launch. The training largely involves the basics, right? Getting in and out the seat, doing the harness, how to respond in the event of an emergency. That said, in an emergency, the system is largely autonomous, right? On the way up, for example, during launch, it's designed to jettison the capsule to a safe distance from the booster. One of the requirements is that any crew member can climb 7 flights of stairs in under 90 seconds. I'm not entirely sure that I can climb 7 flights of stairs in under 90 seconds. And but that was the minimum standard in order to be able to go up. So we would imagine that William Shatner was able to pass that. In terms of the demand, we simply just don't know. We know from SpaceX, for example, that they are supply constrained. They basically said after the mission in Florida, which was a 3-day mission at a much higher altitude, that they hoped to potentially do 4 to 6 flights over the next 12 to 18 months, but that they had a massive backlog of willing paying customers. We haven't had the same signals from Blue Origin, so we just don't know. But remember, on board this capsule, only 2 of the crew are paying customers. The other 2 are being subsidized or paid for by Blue Origin and Bezos.
And just to recap here, you're looking at a live shot of Blue Origin, the NS-18. 4 people on board, 1 including William Shatner, above space at this moment. All right, Ed, just refresh again. What are we looking at?
So on the left-hand side of your screen, you have the booster coming back down to Earth. You know, we're approaching, several minutes into the mission, and at around the 7-minute 30 mark, you'll see the booster land, right? At the moment, it's using aerodynamics. You can see those aft fins on the bottom of your screen that basically position the rocket to slow it down using Earth's atmosphere, the atmospheric resistance, and when it reaches a few thousand feet above the Earth, it will deploy those engines. You'll see that any moment now with the engines reignite with a quick burst to slow it down. The clamp feet will then deploy on the bottom of the booster, and it will land on the landing pad, which I think just came into vision just now. Let's listen in for a quick second. There you have it, like CGI, landing back in Van Horn, Texas, on the landing pad. Meanwhile, of course, the capsule will have begun its descent back down from that suborbital level back down to Earth, guys.
Let's bring back into the conversation Keith Cowing, former NASA employee and editor of the blog Space Ref and NASAWatch.com. Keith, we're watching this. This all seems to be kind of very metronomic. The whole process seems to be sort of very easy to understand and handle. In terms of the bottlenecks to getting this whole process to be accelerated, to, as Ed says, maybe one of these things every month, what are the bottlenecks that we need to overcome to change the rate of change in terms of getting this to become a bigger industry, a wider industry that more people can participate in?
Well, I think what you're seeing right now is that William Shatner has shown that anybody has the right stuff. I've done the training for things like this. I was overtrained compared to what they did. I pulled 6 Gs, and I was in my late 50s, and I'm now in my mid-60s, and I'd go tomorrow if I had the money. But I think what you're going to find, though, is that every time this happens, it becomes more of a familiar thing. And there's, for example, there's nonprofits such as Space for Humanity, which are now offering various ways of either contests or other things to get what you would call a regular person, a non-millionaire, a student, or somebody else to fly to experience this. Because at the end of the day, it's marketing, but perhaps in a less overtly commercial way. So a lot of this is psychological, but this vehicle is clearly designed, as you mentioned. It's automated. It's very difficult to do anything wrong with it, and it's designed to be scaled up. That was the point. You'll see many more of these vehicles as the demand increases, just like you see jetliners lined up at an airport.
And here you have it, the second successful space tourism launch by Blue Origin, capsules coming back into view here. The parachutes have been deployed. Ed, just update us on where we go from here?
Yeah, so this is a leisurely few miles an hour descent back down to Earth. You see there, what happened was the initial drag chutes deployed to slow down the initially, and then the bigger chutes deploy, and it literally touches the capsule back down in Van Horn just a couple of miles from where it lifted off at a speed of a couple of miles an hour. It's a gentle landing. You know, as far as we know from the communications from Blue Origin on Twitter and what we're seeing on the live feed, everything was nominal, normal. The crew, including William Shatner, of course, were able to experience just a few minutes of weightlessness and take in the views of Earth. That is the selling point that Blue Origin tries to get across, right? The windows you see there on the capsule, and there you have touchdown. Safely, it seems, but of course, we'll wait for those live pics of the crew to actually exit the capsule. But as you said, a second successful crewed mission for Blue Origin. One very quick point. Everyone forgets, but Blue Origin managed to successfully land and reuse a booster before SpaceX did. And to Keith's point, they then encountered just endless engineering struggles. And Bezos, as is well documented in Bloomberg senior executive editor Brad Stone's book, pumped money into this company at a rate, an extraordinary rate, and they've been playing catch up. But this is certainly a substantive step forward.
Keith, what is NASA doing while all of this is taking place?
A lot of people there who I used to work with are happy. A lot of people are scratching their heads, in essence, say, why can't we do this? And I think it's sort of what happens in middle age when you realize that the youngsters are just figured out a way to do what you used to do better. It's all a good thing at the end of the day, because I think you wouldn't find a single person at NASA who doesn't just sort of lean back in their chair and say, finally, it's space for the rest of us. Like I said, everybody has the right stuff, and this is no longer going to be something where it's just a couple of people going every now and then. It's going to be many more parts of humanity.
Well, Keith, to that point, I mean, the whole idea of a reusable rocket isn't at all new. And I'm wondering sort of how it shifted from what NASA was doing many decades ago to this.
You know, this is probably something you discuss in your network 5 times a day, the whole issue of whether private sector, you know, I mean, it is. But NASA was always the one who pushed the frontiers, and they did figure out how to do a lot of the stuff. It's just that for whatever reason, we went with the space shuttle or the space launch system. We didn't go with this other stuff, but yet they did have the prescience to go and start with commercial space, and that's why you have SpaceX with the Dragon spacecraft that they now can't build fast enough for commercial people is identical to the one that they're using to go to the space station. So NASA has primed the pump. So again, like I said, it's not sour grapes. It's just like, yeah, it's real now, folks. This is space travel for everybody.
Keith, is this America or is this the world doing this? Because it's a serious issue right now. America does seem to have a lead when it comes to the private space race. Do others follow? Is that lead surmountable? What happens next?
Oh, this is infectious. You're seeing many countries. The UK has spaceports, Australia. You're seeing American companies launching from New Zealand. You're seeing SpaceX is run by a former South African. I mean, this has become global. You see China now doing things, and they're copying SpaceX. So, you know, and of course, the real thing is you may bring up the trash talking between billionaires. When billionaires start trash talking about something, you know it's important because it's important to